Hi, my name's Marjorie. My parents told everyone they had no choice but to give me up, that I was too much to handle. But the truth? They signed me away like paperwork and bought a house with the check they got for doing it. I spent years thinking I was the broken one, but it turns out I was just the most inconvenient part of their story. Want to know how I gave them back a burden they couldn't sell, silence, or forget? Then keep watching. The table was too quiet for a Wednesday. My brother Wendell kept staring at his plate, like the mashed potatoes were giving him answers. Velma had her arms crossed, like always, ready to defend herself before anyone attacked. The roast on my plate had gone cold, and the silence in the room made it feel colder. Garrett, my father, cleared his throat. "Your mom and I talked." He always said that before doing something permanent. Eloise didn't look at me when she spoke. She just tapped her fingernails against her glass. "There's a place, Marjorie, a facility. They can give you more structure, something better suited for your needs." My fork slipped from my fingers and clanged against the plate. I was 10. I didn't know what more structure meant. I just knew that my name wasn't in the sentence about staying. Garrett folded a manila envelope and pushed it toward me like it was a school report card. "We've made arrangements. It's for the best." No one asked if I wanted to go. No one even tried to pretend they were sad. I waited for someone, anyone, to make eye contact. But Wendell never looked up. Velma pulled her sweater tighter around herself. My mom stood up like she was excusing herself from dinner, not from motherhood, and that was it. We didn't finish the meal. The roast stayed untouched. They left the table first, and I stayed until the kitchen light turned off. I didn't sleep that night. I stared at the ceiling until I heard footsteps at my door, followed by a soft knock. I didn't answer. Eloise walked in anyway. "It's time." She handed me a plastic grocery bag. "You won't need much. They have clothes there." "My bear?" She paused. "It's better not to get attached." At 3 a.m, I stepped onto the front porch in socks and sneakers that didn't match. A sedan with faded paint idled in the driveway. A woman in a beige windbreaker leaned against it, flipping through paperwork. The porch light was the only thing left on. I looked back once. No silhouette in the window, no wave. The light clicked off before I even reached the sidewalk. I climbed into the back seat. The woman, her badge said Lynn M., offered me gum. I shook my head. We pulled away from the curb, and the house grew smaller behind us. The same house I had colored pictures in, where I learned to braid my hair, where I scraped my knees and tried to stop the bleeding with paper towels. Gone. Half an hour into the ride, Lynn glanced at me through the mirror. "You okay, sweetheart?" I wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. "Am I still their daughter?" I whispered. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You're a very brave girl, Marjorie." That was the first time someone called me brave. It didn't make me feel better. It just made me feel further away from home. I leaned my head against the window. Outside, everything was dark and empty, like no one in the world was awake but me. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink hard. I just sat there, quiet, still, until sleep pulled me under. Not because I was tired, but because I already knew no one would be waiting when I woke up. When they finally read the card, it wasn't the message that haunted them. It was who left it. I didn't stick around to see anyone find it. I didn't need to. Some truths don't need witnesses. They just need to be left in plain sight. 3 days earlier, I stood outside the Des Moines bus terminal with a letter in my coat pocket and a headache that wouldn't let go. The letter hadn't been meant for me. It was addressed to family and friends of Eloise Holloway, postmarked from Velma's address, forwarded to a P.O. box I hadn't touched in months. I almost tossed it, but I opened it, just in case, and "You are warmly invited to celebrate the 80th birthday of our beloved Eloise Holloway. Join us for a garden luncheon and family tribute." Beloved. That word stuck with me more than the rest. The sky that morning was overcast, not dramatic or ominous, just indifferent. Kind of like my family. I walked the few blocks to their house, not because I wanted to, but because I needed to see it with my own eyes. Needed to know if it had all really happened, or if I had made it worse in my mind over the years. There it was. Same white siding, same wind chimes on the porch. But now the yard was littered with balloons, folding chairs, and people I hadn't seen since I was a child. Laughing, hugging, pouring lemonade like nothing in this world had ever gone wrong. I stood across the street for a while before crossing. A neighbor spotted me and waved. "You lost, hun." Catering's around back. Before I could answer, another woman stepped forward, smiling politely. "Oh, are you with the event staff?" I looked at her, square in the face. "No, I'm the ghost no one invited." She blinked. I walked past her, slow and steady. Garrett was sitting in a lawn chair by the rose bushes, holding court. People came by to shake his hand, to tell him what a strong man he was. I saw Wendell refill his lemonade. Velma was busy directing the playlist, making sure the string lights were just right. Not once did any of them look toward the street. I didn't walk into the yard. I didn't raise my voice or wave my arms. Instead, I stayed in the blind spot they built over decades, where I was safest and most dangerous. I drifted around to the back, staying on the outer path, careful not to step on the freshly mowed grass. On the patio was a slideshow playing on a rented projector. Childhood photos, mostly black and white. Velma in pigtails, Wendell holding a baseball glove, Garrett in his work uniform. No pictures of me. Not a single one. Not even the one from the Christmas I broke my wrist helping Mom carry firewood. Not the one where I stood next to the birthday cake they claimed I didn't need that year. I wasn't just forgotten. I had been cut out. I stared through the window for a long minute, letting the laughter from inside fill the air around me. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out the card. Simple, white, handwritten. "Some things don't die. You just stopped mentioning them." I slipped it under a potted fern by the back steps. Then I turned and walked back the way I came. Not because it hurt too much to stay, but because they didn't earn the right to see how much it still hurt. As I walked away, a man at the edge of the yard caught my eye. He squinted, then tilted his head. "Wait. Marjorie?" I didn't answer. He called after me again, louder this time. I kept walking. I reached the sidewalk, exhaled through my nose, and adjusted the strap of my purse. It was heavier than when I arrived somehow. Maybe that's what truth does. It weighs more when it's carried alone. By the time I reached the corner, the music faded behind me. A cover of "You Are My Sunshine" played on acoustic guitar. I hadn't heard that song since Eloise hummed it while packing my bag the night she told me I was too much for their life. It didn't make me nostalgic. It made me tired. I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I just left and smiled, knowing they'd find the card after the cake was cut. The next morning, I caught the early bus back to Omaha. My body stayed upright, but my mind wandered in places I hadn't let it touch for years. Every time the tires hummed against the highway, it felt like a stitch pulling loose in a memory I hadn't sewn shut properly. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I stopped by the corner diner across from the Greyhound station. Coffee there tasted like burnt regret, but the server always remembered my name, and that kind of consistency was rare currency in my world. Back at my room above the boarding house, there was a stack of mail waiting inside the door. Junk mostly, coupons, a dentist flyer, a postcard from some church I'd never joined. But one envelope stood out. No return address. The handwriting was stiff, like it came from someone who didn't write much anymore. Inside was a short note. "I kept this. I didn't know if you'd want it. Florence Maddox." Tucked behind the note was a scan of a document. Yellowed, stamped, signed in two hands, I recognized immediately. Garrett Holloway, Eloise Granger Holloway. Parental consent form. Termination of guardianship. Legal custody transferred to the state of Iowa. I held the page closer, my eyes scanning every detail. There was a handwritten receipt attached. Amount disbursed, $4,200. Below it, the date, just 5 days before the deed transfer on their new house. They didn't just let me go. They sold me. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, letting the room go quiet around me. The radiator knocked. A siren echoed down the block. But all I could hear was Eloise's voice that night by the door. "It's better not to get attached." I thought I was the problem. The high-maintenance child. Too sensitive, too much. Turns out I was just inconvenient and profitable. Later that afternoon, I went to the public library. I asked to use the archive computer and pulled up county records. It took less than 10 minutes to find it. A second mortgage issued to Garrett Holloway 6 days after my placement. The number matched. There it was in black and white. I wasn't unwanted. I was liquidated. That night, lying in bed with the lights off, I stared at the ceiling, remembering the bunk beds at the group home. Some girls cried themselves to sleep. Some got care packages. I never got either. I just folded into myself and learned to take up less space. It made me less of a target. I used to believe they gave me up because they didn't know what else to do, that maybe they were desperate, overwhelmed, afraid. But the truth was much simpler. They chose comfort over me, and for the first time in years, I wasn't crushed by that realization. I was clear-headed. The next morning, I dressed deliberately. Slacks, button-down shirt, pulled my hair back. No emotion, no softness. I took the train to the legal district and spent 3 hours at the law library. Downloaded every precedent I could find on post-placement fraud, financial benefit tied to wardship transfers, and violations of state subsidy disclosures. I took notes, bookmarked files, highlighted language, statute by statute. The librarian leaned over once and asked, "You working on a case?" I looked her in the eye. "Not yet, but I'm getting ready." That night, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror with the file from Florence in one hand and a notepad in the other. "I thought they were just done with me," I whispered to my own reflection. But they weren't. They cashed in on me. I tore the page from my notepad and wrote one sentence across it. They monetized my silence. Then I flipped it over and added, "Let's see how much noise I can make." I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something inside me shifted, just slightly enough to tip the scales back in my favor. And in that record, she wouldn't need to raise her voice, only show the receipt. The invitation to the will reading came through email, impersonal, like a subscription renewal notice. The sender was the family attorney's office. Subject line, "Reading of estate, Eloise Holloway." The date and time were firm. No condolences, just a note saying I was named as a legal party with interest. I showed up 10 minutes early, not to prove a point, just because I didn't want anyone saying I came in late looking for attention. The firm was downtown, a bland office building with a single potted plant by the elevator that hadn't been watered in weeks. When I entered the conference room, they were already seated. Velma, with her blazer buttoned too tight, pretended to check her phone. Wendell offered me a brief nod, the kind you'd give someone you sort of recognized from the DMV. Garrett sat hunched at the far end of the table, hands folded, eyes cloudy. The attorney cleared his throat and opened a manila folder. No preamble, no acknowledgement that I hadn't seen any of them in decades. Just the facts. To my daughter Velma and my son Wendell, I leave the estate, including the primary residence and remaining financial assets. To Marjorie Blythe, formerly under our guardianship until 1979, no provision shall be made. There it was. Not just rejection, legal erasure, no gasp, no apology, no confusion. Just paper, printed and signed. I wasn't a person to them. I was a clause. Velma looked toward the window. Garrett exhaled, like he was relieved it was done. Wendell dropped his gaze to his lap. No one said my name. Afterward, as everyone rose to leave, Lorraine lingered by the door. She looked unsure, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Finally, she caught up to me as I was zipping my coat. "Can I ask you something?" she said softly. I turned toward her, waiting. "Were you adopted or something?" I didn't flinch. "No," I said. "I was returned." Her mouth opened like she wanted to respond, but nothing came out. She looked away, and in that silence, I saw it. The beginning of doubt. The question she hadn't been allowed to ask until now. Maybe it was the first time she realized adults don't always tell the truth. I stepped past her without another word. Later that week, I sat in my apartment and wrote a letter to the firm. Short, precise. I do not contest the contents of the will. I do, however, reserve the right to publicly correct any omissions, factual or otherwise, through any legal or journalistic means I deem appropriate. I mailed it certified. 3 days later, Velma called. "I don't understand what you think this is going to accomplish," she snapped. "It's not like you were ever really part of this family." I paused, holding the phone away from my ear for a second to breathe. Then, calmly, "That's exactly the part I plan to clarify, for anyone else who's ever wondered." "You're embarrassing yourself," she hissed. I let that sit. "No, I'm just done letting you rewrite the past like I never existed. You always had a flair for the dramatic, and you always had a knack for pretending things were clean when they were just hidden." She hung up. That night, I retrieved the file from Florence, the parental surrender form, the payout stub, the faded date stamps. I slid them into a folder labeled Narrative Control. I didn't need to scream. I just needed to keep the facts straight. People like Velma thrived in silence, in quiet edits and missing photos. But I didn't owe her the comfort of being forgotten anymore. The truth doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to outlast the lie. So she decided to make her truth permanent, even if no one asked for it. 2 mornings after the letter to Velma was sent, I got a call from the hospital. "Mrs. Holloway's condition is declining," the nurse said. "We were told you were listed as emergency contact, since no one else is available." I didn't ask why I was the fallback. I already knew. They only remembered me when something needed signing. It was cloudy when I pulled into the hospital's rear parking lot. The kind of day where light can't decide if it wants to stay or go. I checked in, walked the familiar halls, and followed the quiet beeping toward the palliative wing. Eloise was alone. No flowers, no framed photos. Just her and the sound of machines doing what her body could no longer manage on its own. She turned her head slightly when I entered. Her eyes didn't widen. No surprise. Just the tired recognition of someone who knew the end wasn't far. "You came," she whispered, as though that fact carried weight. "I was called," I replied, pulling the chair closer. I didn't reach for her hand. She didn't offer it. After a long silence, she asked, "Did it hurt that much?" I blinked, unsure if she meant my absence or her own choices. Eloise sighed. "I did what I thought was best. For the others." I kept my voice steady. "And for me?" She didn't answer, just turned her face toward the ceiling tiles, like she might find her justification hidden up there. For 10 minutes, we sat with nothing between us but a history we never said aloud. Then she drifted off. A nurse entered softly. "She wanted you to have this," she said, handing me a small metal tin. "Told me it was important. Said you'd know what to do with it." I didn't open it right away. I waited until I was outside, sitting in my car, hands still shaking despite the stillness of the moment. Inside was a folded birth certificate, creased, weathered. Beneath it, the surrender form again, only this time with a signature that looked shakier than the version I'd already seen. And under that, a letter. Unsent. Addressed to me. The paper had browned at the edges. The handwriting wobbled, like it had been written through tears. Or tremors. "You cried just like I did when I was young. I couldn't watch it again. It brought too much back. I wish you could understand that." That was it. No apology, no, I was wrong. Just one woman's attempt to justify another girl's pain through the mirror of her own. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the tin. Not because I forgave her, but because some things are too heavy to hold and too cruel to throw away. That afternoon, I drove out to the storage unit I hadn't visited in years. It was still there, tucked behind a strip mall and a discount tire place, smelling faintly of old insulation and rubber. Inside, I unlocked a plastic container labeled Keep, court records, medical papers, faded Polaroids with me cropped out or scribbled over, tax filings that never listed me as a dependent past 79. I set the tin gently in the center and closed the lid. Then I placed it inside a fireproof metal box I bought after my divorce. On the outside, a label I printed that morning. Truth, not for court, for history. If they had wanted to bury me, they should have destroyed the paperwork. As I locked the unit and walked back to my car, I didn't feel triumphant, just settled. Like some invisible piece had clicked into place, not because the past was fixed, but because I'd finally drawn the border around it myself. People think closure is about forgiveness. It isn't. It's about ownership. And for the first time in my life, I owned the story. Even the parts that broke me. I didn't tell anyone I left that storage unit. I just drove. No music, no phone calls. I let the silence hold space around me. By the time I reached my apartment, the sun had dipped low behind the buildings, throwing long shadows across the street. I was putting my keys down when the phone rang, the kind of ring that somehow sounded urgent before I even looked at the screen. It was Lorraine. Her voice cracked before she finished the first sentence. "It's Grandpa. He collapsed. The ambulance took him to County General." "Where's Velma?" I asked, already reaching for my coat. "She flew to Portland for some conference. Wendell said he doesn't want to get involved." "Of course he didn't." "What do they need from me?" I said, though I already knew. "They need someone to sign the paperwork, for next steps. And you're the only one legally eligible now." I didn't answer, not right away. "It's just, he keeps asking for someone. I think he's scared." I closed my eyes. Of course it came back to me. The one they filed away. I hung up gently and slid my bag onto my shoulder, already thinking through what I'd need. I wasn't going there for comfort. I was going because someone had to show up, just like no one had for me. By the time I arrived, the hospital halls smelled like lemon cleaner and resignation. Nurses nodded politely. One of them guided me through double doors into a smaller unit where the lights were dimmed and the voices hushed. Garrett was in a recliner, hooked to monitors, eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in uneven patterns. He looked smaller than I remembered. Less like the man who once told me, "Quiet girls get kept longer," and more like a shell waiting to be handled. A nurse appeared with a clipboard. "You're Ms. Blythe?" I nodded. "You're listed as the only adult child not formally waived of medical proxy. We need consent to proceed with care options, long-term planning." She handed me a pen. Funny, how the weight of a signature could suddenly flip a lifetime upside down. I signed. The nurse gave me a look, soft but measured. "He may not have much time." "He's had more than enough," I said, setting the clipboard down. I walked out without looking back. The next morning, I met with Tamsin Greer in her downtown office. She'd been my quiet advisor for years, someone who never pried, only listened and acted when asked. I handed her a stack of files, photocopies of the custody transfer, state subsidy breakdowns, timeline overlays of the second mortgage. She flipped through the pages, eyes sharp. "You're not doing this to save him, are you?" "No," I said. "I'm doing it so the system has to look at what they let him do. To me, and probably others." She nodded slowly. "You don't have to provide care." "I know," I said, "but I can control what happens next." She tapped a few keys on her laptop, then looked up. "If we file for temporary guardianship, we can trigger a review of his finances, of his ethics as a past guardian." "And Velma? She won't be happy." I let out a quiet breath. That's not my concern. 3 days later, we filed. Court records updated. Judge approved temporary oversight. A financial review was ordered. Quietly, but officially. Velma and Wendell were served notices. The calls came within hours. Velma's voice was sharp, nearly shrill. "What are you trying to do, Marjorie? He's dying." No, I said calmly. He's finally being held accountable. You're dragging this family through the mud. You already buried me in it. I'm just making sure someone checks the foundation. She cursed, then hung up. I didn't feel satisfied, but I felt even. That night, I opened my notebook and wrote in the same corner I had written years ago. They filed me away. I filed them back. Not out of spite, but because no one should be forced to disappear quietly, and the silence was about to collapse under the weight of everything they'd buried. The local newsletter came out every other Tuesday. I hadn't subscribed in years, but somehow a copy found its way into my mailbox that morning. Folded neatly, like it hadn't been tampered with. It had no name on the byline, but the title stood out like a bruise on pale skin. The Daughter Who Disappeared. The story didn't mention me by name. It didn't have to. The timeline was clear. 1979. The financial transaction. The quiet removal of a child under the guise of what's best for the family. The closing line read, "Some people were buried alive, not to die, but to be forgotten." The phones in that house must have lit up like Christmas. I didn't write it, but I knew who did. A former social worker's niece, now a journalist, had reached out a few months ago asking vague questions about long-closed guardianship cases. I gave her nothing, but maybe the paper trail spoke louder than I ever could. By midday, people were whispering at the grocery store. I caught a woman near the apples muttering, "You think it's about the Holloways?" The man beside her didn't answer, just shook his head slowly, like he didn't want to be caught saying what he already knew. 3 days later, I was invited, unofficially, to the church service honoring Eloise. I wasn't sure why I went. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the sick need to witness how they'd package her legacy now that she wasn't around to defend it. The foyer was decorated with soft lavender cloth, candles in glass vases, and a folding table covered with framed photographs. A slideshow ran silently in the background. I stood at the edge of the room until I spotted it. The photo. It was from 1980. Supposed to be the last full family picture before Velma's college graduation. Garrett sat in the middle, Velma on one side, Wendell on the other. There was a gap, noticeable, awkward. And then I saw it. A jagged edge, where a face had been cut out, literally removed with scissors. No digital editing, no Photoshop, just old-school erasure with intent. They hadn't even replaced me with someone. They just edited me out. I walked closer. A few people stepped aside, murmuring. No one stopped me. I stared at that picture and didn't blink. If they erased me from their past, I said out loud, not caring who heard, I'll write myself into their future. I didn't touch the photo. I didn't tear it or frame it. I just took a picture with my phone and walked away. That was the evidence. That was enough. Later that evening, while I was finishing dishes, the phone rang. Velma. I let it ring twice before answering. "What did you do?" she barked. Her voice was taut, brittle, like a rubber band stretched too far. "I didn't do anything," I said, drying my hands on a dish towel. "But it sounds like the truth finally did." "This is harassment. You think you can just drag this family through the mud with these lies?" "Velma, if it's a lie, why does it hurt so much?" There was silence on her end, the kind that only follows being cornered. "You think you're clever," she spat, "but you're just bitter." "Maybe," I said evenly, "but I've got paperwork to back up every word. You can sue over slander, Velma, but not over the truth." She cursed and hung up. I didn't flinch. Instead, I sat down and wrote in my notebook. Again, same black pen, same top right corner. They thought silence protected them, but now silence speaks louder than I ever could. Let them scramble. Let them make calls. Let them spin a story. The thing about silence is, once it cracks, it echoes. But when a door closes on the past, sometimes a window opens towards something softer. The check cleared on a Tuesday. It wasn't flashy. No announcement. No parade. Just a quiet confirmation from the title office that the house at 204 Briar Lane, the same one my parents bought after signing me away, was now legally mine. I didn't tell anyone, didn't need to. A week later, I met Anihi Delgado outside the front porch. She was holding a toddler on her hip, her other hand resting protectively on the shoulder of a shy boy with curls. Her eyes darted toward the front window, then back to me. "I'm not sure what to say," she whispered. "You don't have to say anything," I told her, sliding the key across the porch railing. "It's yours, $1 a month, no catches." She blinked, unsure if I was joking. "I don't want it to be a tomb," I added, watching her son lean toward the flower bed. "I want it to be a home again." She hesitated for just a moment before accepting the key, her fingers trembling slightly. I nodded once, stepped off the porch, and didn't look back. I hadn't walked past that mailbox in years. And now, not only had I bought the house they funded with my disappearance, I'd given it to someone who reminded me of the version of myself I never got to be. Hopeful, fragile, still believing a house could keep you safe. That Friday, I was sitting on my porch, sipping weak tea, when the nurse rolled Garrett up to the edge of my walkway. His chair clicked against the uneven pavement, wheels squeaking softly. He didn't recognize me at first. Then, slowly, something registered. His eyes narrowed. Not with anger, but with a searching sort of fatigue. "You live across from your own father," he said, "and won't even come say hello?" I didn't shift, just placed my cup down and answered. "I tried to once. No one listened." He stared at me. "I learned silence speaks louder here," I added. He looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly in his lap. No arguments, no excuses, just stillness. A moment passed where I thought he might ask to come in. He didn't. Instead, his chin began to quiver. Tears formed at the corners of his eyes, but never fell. I stayed seated. He waited. I didn't invite him. He didn't beg. And when the nurse began to wheel him back down the driveway, I stood slowly, walked to the door, and closed it gently behind me. Not with malice, not with rage, just closure. The next morning, I stepped out onto the porch and saw Anahi and her son planting tulip bulbs along the edge of the yard. She smiled when she saw me, brushing hair from her face with dirt-smudged fingers. The boy waved. I waved back. A few minutes later, Lorraine walked up the sidewalk, holding a manila envelope. She paused at my gate, then slipped it into my mailbox without saying a word. I waited until she disappeared around the corner before opening it. Inside was a letter. "You didn't just reclaim your story, you rewrote ours too." No signature, but I knew the handwriting. I stood there for a long time, envelope in hand, sun warming my face. Then I walked back inside, unlocked the fireproof box, and placed it alongside the old court records, letters, photos, and the worn-out tin from the hospital. I closed the lid with both hands. "It's not about justice anymore," I whispered. "It's about ending the cycle." And I meant it. The lid clicked shut, soft but final. It was early evening by then, the kind of time when the sky couldn't decide whether it wanted to hold on to the sun or let it go. I sat down at the kitchen table and stared at the letter one more time before placing it under the stack of envelopes beside the fruit bowl. No return address, no name, but I knew it was Lorraine. Her handwriting carried the kind of weight that comes when a young person tries to be careful with their words, not out of fear, but out of hope. "You didn't just reclaim your story, you rewrote ours too." There was more on the back, smaller script, like she'd written it without planning to, as if the truth just kept spilling out. "They raised us to believe pain was best ignored, that pretending meant healing. You made it real. That's why I believe you. If no one ever apologized, I'm sorry. Not for what happened, but for not realizing it sooner." I folded the letter and sat with it resting in my lap. I didn't cry. There was no dramatic music playing in my head, no swelling of emotions. Just a quiet recognition of something I hadn't even known I was waiting to hear. An acknowledgement that didn't come with excuses, no justifications, no signature trying to validate itself, only the kind of apology that lands when it has no reason to. And that's why it matters. The following Tuesday, I stopped by the community center just after lunch. Miss Helen, the receptionist with the southern drawl and quick hands, greeted me with her usual smile. "You here for the craft fair?" she asked. "Not today," I said, holding out a manila folder. She looked at it, then at me. "You need a copy machine?" "No, I'm here to donate something." I asked to speak to the director. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from a man who had probably spent his life listening to other people's broken things. I handed him the folder. Inside were my updated estate papers and a check for $50,000. "I'd like to set up a grant," I said, "for women who've been discarded, who were called difficult, dramatic, too much, or not enough." He flipped through the documents slowly. "What would you like it called?" "The Blythe Grant, for women discarded but not done." He smiled, but didn't say anything. I added, "This isn't about rewriting history. It's about making sure the next woman doesn't drown in it." As I stood to leave, I caught the eye of a young woman in the lobby. She had a stroller with a sleeping infant and a backpack that looked like it had survived one too many winters. Our eyes met for only a second, but she nodded. I nodded back. No words exchanged. None needed. Later that week, on a bright Saturday morning, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. The house across the street, mine once, then theirs, now Anahi's, looked alive again. The tulips were blooming along the fence. The front windows were open. I could hear soft laughter coming from inside. Lorraine showed up just after 10. She didn't text. She never did. She just started appearing more and more, like water seeping through a cracked foundation, not to destroy, but to soften. She sat beside me, her legs pulled up under her. We didn't talk for a while. Eventually, she asked, "Do you ever wonder what it might have been like if they'd made a different choice?" I took a long sip before answering. "No," I said. "I wonder who I would have become if I'd waited for them to." She didn't say anything back, just reached down and plucked a petal from a tulip near her foot. A few minutes passed. Then, softly, she said, "You're not a burden, Aunt Marjorie." I looked out at the garden, where things had started to grow again. "Not anymore," I said. "Not to me." We sat in the silence, not needing to fill it. And I realized then that some things we don't repair. Not because we can't, but because we've learned how to live differently without them. She wasn't healed, she wasn't whole, but she was finally her own. Before we close this chapter, let me share something with you. Just one thought, from someone who has carried silence longer than most people carry names. I used to believe that healing meant things going back to how they were. That one day, someone would say sorry, and all the broken pieces would fit together again like a puzzle. But now I know, healing isn't about fixing what happened, it's about owning it, so it no longer owns you. Sometimes the justice we seek won't come from courtrooms or apologies. It will come from choosing not to pass the same wound to someone else. Sometimes the win is not revenge, it's peace. If you've ever felt like the one they forgot, the one left out of the photo, the will, or even the dinner table, this story is for you. You are not invisible. You were never the burden. And your silence? It deserves to be broken in your own way, in your own time. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been erased from your own story, by your family, by your history, or by someone who said they loved you? If so, drop a 1 in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I'd love to hear your story, your thoughts, or even your silence, because here, you matter. And if you didn't like the video, tell me why. I'm listening. Maybe someone else needs to hear your version too. If this story touched you, helped you breathe a little deeper, or made you feel just a bit more seen, please consider subscribing to the channel. There's more to come, more voices, more stories, more truth. Click that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. Because around here, the stories don't just get told, they get reclaimed.